Now, as a last topic, we can also look at how people perceive biological motion. And it turns out that people are absolute experts in this, that we need very, very little information to actually decipher that we're looking at biological motion versus just motion of objects of something else. And the way to show this is by this little demo here, where you can see that here's a point light display, is what this is called. So you just see some points that are moving. They're just white dots moving. But I'm sure that none of you have trouble immediately perceiving this as if it's a person who's walking. You can then actually play around. Well, first of all, I can add some limbs to it, but even if I don't do that, I can play around with whether this person is a male or a female. So you see here a male walk, you see here a female walking. And people are very good at seeing these images and actually determining what they're looking at. We can play around with whether this person is heavy or light. So you see here for heavier, the movements become a little bit more worked, a little slower. Lighter tends to be higher frequency movements. We can play around with whether this person is nervous or relaxed. So nervous, we really go in places. Relaxed is much more slow. And we can actually even play around with people's moods, whether they're happy, more of an upbeat walk, versus when they're sad, and it's a much more timid, relaxed walk, or a slower walk, sorry. And what's interesting about this, actually, at some point I collaborated with somebody who was this small female from Germany, and she was very intense. And the way she walked was honestly looked kind of like this. She was light, she was typically kind of anxious, she was fairly happy. So whenever she would come down the hallway, it kind of looked like this. You could imagine it was a little intimidating. So interestingly, here we can actually decipher biological movements almost effortlessly just based on some point line displays, some dots that we're being presented with. And what's interesting about this is that from these point light displays, we infer cues such as cues about the structure, the width of the shoulders and the hips. That tells us something about whether this is most likely a male or a female. And then there's also these dynamic cues, meaning the movements of the dots themselves, where we see, for example, body sway going on, and we can detect differences based on that. And then we're even able to decipher a person's mood based on this fairly well. This is thought to be an innate ability because babies are actually fairly good at this too. They tend to look more at movement of biological motion, the dots, than random movement patterns. Because of course you could just cluster shuffle these dots and have them just move randomly across the screen with the exact same amount of movement, but not in this pattern. And indeed, in that case, babies are not that interested. They're much more interested in movements that correspond to biological motion. So in that sense, biological motion appears to be special. Newborns tend to look at biological motion more than non-biological motion. And what's interesting too about this is that they have a preference for both normal and upside down biological motion versus random motion at about 3 months of age. But at 5 months of age, they actually start showing a preference for upright biological motion. And when you think about that, that makes sense because at 5 months of age, most babies start sitting up. And until you sit upright, whether something is up or down doesn't actually really matter. Because when you're laying on your back, right, it just happens to be where somebody's standing. If they're standing above your head, they look they look normal. They look upside down. If they stand in front of you, they look upright. If you start sitting up, now all of a sudden upright motion is perceived much more often than upside down motion. And exactly at that age, these babies are starting to show a preference for upright biological motion versus upside down biological motion. There's also, of course, patient work that actually shows that biological motion is processed differently than non-biological motion.